What if I told you the most powerful revolution in history didn't begin with an army, but with a quiet voice by the sea? What if the man they tried to silence became the name that still echoes across centuries? Today, you're not just going to hear a story. You're going to step inside it. You'll stand on the shore of Galilee and feel the wind that carried words no one had ever heard before. You'll witness unconditional love confronting fear without raising its voice. You'll walk through betrayal, injustice, silence, and a tomb that was never meant to stay closed. And just when everything seems lost, you'll see why eternal hope cannot be buried. This isn't just about crucifixion. It's about resurrection power. It's about living faith that survived doubt, betrayal, and death itself. And here's the real question. If this story is still alive, what does that mean for you today? Stay with me until the end, because the final moments will bring this ancient story into your life in a way you might not expect. If you believe stories can change hearts, go ahead and like this video. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful story we bring to life. Now, let's go back to the shore. It started like any other morning by the water, salt in the air, gulls arguing like they owned the sky, fishermen with rough hands pulling nets as if the sea was a stubborn old friend, and people strolling with that tired look of folks who've learned not to expect miracles. They weren't looking for a revolution, just a decent catch, a quiet day, maybe a laugh to forget the bills and the bruises of life. You know that feeling when the world is loud but your heart feels even louder inside? That's how it was. Lots of noise, little peace, and everyone pretending they were fine. Then, almost casually, a young man appeared near the shoreline, not surrounded by soldiers or gold, but by something rarer, calm. No flashy entrance, no look at me energy, just a presence that made people slow down without even realizing it. And before anyone could ask who he was, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He spoke the way a friend speaks when they actually mean it. No fancy show, no rehearsed performance, just words that landed soft at first, then deeper, like stones skipping and suddenly sinking into places no one had touched in years. His voice didn't feel like a lecture. It felt like someone turning on a light in a room you forgot was dark. People leaned in because it wasn't just sound, it was warmth, like unconditional love wrapped in ordinary language. He looked at strangers the way a father looks at a child who thinks they're invisible, and somehow that gaze carried grace without a single word needing to be explained. There was a quiet authority in him, not the kind that demands silence, but the kind that earns it naturally. You could sense a divine purpose in the rhythm of his pauses, as if even the wind waited for the next sentence. And in that moment, something inside the crowd began to shift, subtle but undeniable. Fishermen who had spent their lives battling waves felt their shoulders relax for the first time in years, as if humble strength was standing right in front of them in human form. Mothers holding restless children found those little ones unusually still, almost as if they recognized a voice older than time itself. Even the skeptics, the ones who crossed their arms and muttered, "We've heard teachers before," couldn't quite look away. He didn't promise wealth, power, or an easy road. Instead, he spoke about a kingdom of heaven that began inside the heart, about inner transformation that no empire could control. He told stories, simple stories about seeds, fields, lost coins, and open doors, yet somehow those stories carried eternal hope. It was like watching someone water dry soil and realizing the ground had been thirsty all along. And deep down, each listener felt a whisper, maybe this isn't just another preacher. There was something fearless in the way he spoke about forgiveness, as if mercy wasn't weakness but the strongest force in existence. He didn't shame the broken hearts in the crowd. He restored them, one sentence at a time, as if stitching torn fabric with invisible thread. When he talked about loving your neighbor, he didn't say it like a rule. He said it like a rescue plan for humanity. You could almost see spiritual awakening happening in real time, eyes widening, jaws unclenching, hands loosening from fists they'd carried for years. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that's what impressed them the most. No throne, no sword, no political campaign, just truth delivered with a calm that made fear feel out of place. And the more he spoke, the more people realized this wasn't entertainment. This was light in the darkness. Word traveled fast along those shores, faster than any fishing boat could sail, because people left whispering about what they'd just experienced. "You've got to hear him," they said, not because he performed miracles yet, but because he made you feel seen. His unconditional love didn't flatter, it confronted gently, like someone holding up a mirror and smiling while you rediscovered yourself. There was grace in his laughter and depth in his silence, and both felt equally intentional. Some felt their living faith awakening for the first time, while others struggled to explain why their cynicism felt suddenly fragile. He spoke about redemption as if it wasn't a distant dream but a present invitation, open to anyone willing to believe. And without announcing it, he began building something no one could fully measure. As the sun climbed higher, casting gold across the sea, the crowd grew thicker, drawn not by spectacle but by the magnetic pull of hope. You could sense courage to believe stirring in people who had buried their expectations years ago. He didn't rush his words, he let them breathe, like seeds needing space before they break the surface. The fishermen forgot their nets, the merchants forgot their schedules, and even the restless stopped fidgeting. There was a sacred simplicity in the way he described God with us, not distant, not cold, but near enough to feel. And in that closeness, hearts that had grown defensive began to soften. Yet even as peace spread quietly among the people, something else was beginning to stir beyond the shoreline. Because whenever light in the darkness shines too clearly, shadows start to move, and not everyone celebrates awakening. Some observers stood at a distance, calculating, measuring influence, sensing that this young Galilean carried more than kind words, he carried fearless truth. His humble strength didn't threaten the poor, but it unsettled those who relied on control. The same unconditional love that healed broken hearts also exposed hypocrisy without raising its voice. And while the crowd felt eternal hope blooming inside them, others felt their power subtly trembling. No one there fully understood it yet, but history had just shifted direction by that sea. And what began as a quiet morning would soon echo far beyond those waves. The next days by the sea didn't feel ordinary anymore, because once someone tastes eternal hope, it's hard to go back to surviving on routine alone. People began following him not out of curiosity, but out of hunger, the kind of hunger that bread can't fix. Fishermen left their boats mid-repair, mothers adjusted their schedules, old men who rarely moved from their shaded corners walked miles just to hear him again. It wasn't hype, it wasn't manipulation, it was something deeper, a quiet authority that felt safe. You could see it in their eyes. They weren't chasing miracles yet, they were chasing meaning. And he, with that humble strength, welcomed them like they'd always belonged there. But what truly changed everything wasn't just what he said, it was what he did next. One afternoon, a man pushed through the crowd, his body marked by illness and his reputation already buried under whispers of shame. People stepped back instinctively, because society has always been good at labeling the wounded. But Jesus didn't step back. He stepped forward. That single movement carried more unconditional love than 1,000 speeches ever could. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't sanitize the moment for comfort. Instead, he reached out with grace so natural it felt like the most obvious thing in the world, and suddenly the air shifted again. You see, forgiveness wasn't an abstract concept for him, it was a living act, a force stronger than fear. When he touched the untouchable, he wasn't just healing a body. He was restoring dignity, rewriting identity, awakening living faith in everyone watching. It was inner transformation unfolding in real time, like watching winter melt into spring. Some gasped, some cried, some looked away because redemption can be uncomfortable when you've built your life around judgment. But the healed man didn't care about their discomfort. He cared that, for the first time in years, he felt seen without condemnation. And in that moment, broken hearts began to believe that maybe they weren't beyond repair after all. Then there was the day he walked into the house of a man no one respected, a tax collector whose wealth came with isolation. The crowd muttered, because grace applied to the wrong people always stirs tension. But Jesus sat at that table like it was the most natural place for divine purpose to unfold. He spoke not with accusation, but with fearless truth wrapped in mercy, and something inside that hardened man cracked open. It wasn't guilt that changed him, it was unconditional love meeting him at eye level. And that's the thing about sacred transformation. It happens fastest where it's least expected. Children ran to him without fear, and he didn't wave them away like busy leaders often do. He knelt. He laughed. He listened. That simple act carried kingdom of heaven energy more powerful than any throne ever could. Parents watched in awe, because in his presence their children seemed calmer, freer, lighter, as if light in the darkness had become tangible. He reminded grown adults how to trust again, how to soften again, how to believe again. And slowly, without force, he began rebuilding the architecture of human hearts. What made it powerful wasn't spectacle, it was consistency. Every encounter echoed the same rhythm: grace over condemnation, mercy over hierarchy, restoration over exclusion. He wasn't building followers addicted to excitement. He was awakening spiritual awakening rooted in courage to believe. And that's why the crowds kept growing, not because he dazzled them, but because he dignified them. You could almost feel redemption spreading like sunlight across stone streets and dusty paths. Yet the brighter his influence became, the more certain eyes began watching from the shadows. Because while the poor felt hope rising like breath after suffocation, others felt their control quietly slipping through their fingers. His quiet authority wasn't loud, but it was unstoppable. His unconditional love wasn't political, but it was disruptive. The same grace that healed broken hearts was beginning to expose systems built on pride and fear. And as living faith started igniting across villages, whispers began forming in closed rooms far from the shoreline. What they didn't realize yet was that confronting light requires stepping into it, and that was a risk they weren't ready to take. At first, the leaders watched from a distance, arms folded, faces composed, pretending curiosity while calculating influence. They had seen teachers before, prophets before, movements before, and most faded like morning mist. But this felt different. His quiet authority didn't depend on titles, and that was unsettling. He didn't quote power to gain power. He spoke as if truth itself stood behind him. And when truth carries fearless clarity, it doesn't need to shout. It simply stands, and that alone can threaten entire systems. The more he spoke about the kingdom of heaven, the clearer it became that he wasn't describing territory, but transformation. He spoke of mercy over sacrifice, of forgiveness over ritual, of inner transformation over public performance. That message hit deeper than any sword ever could. Because when you tell people that God with us means access without hierarchy, you quietly dismantle control. And control, especially religious control, rarely surrenders without resistance. So smiles grew thinner in certain circles, and whispers began multiplying behind closed doors. One afternoon, surrounded by scholars and respected voices of the law, he answered their traps with calm precision. They questioned his authority, tested his theology, tried to corner him publicly. But his responses weren't defensive, they were luminous. He exposed hypocrisy not with humiliation, but with fearless truth wrapped in grace. It was like watching a mirror being lifted in a room full of masks. Some felt conviction. Others felt exposed. And exposure, when pride is involved, quickly turns into hostility. He spoke about loving enemies, about humility, about leaders serving instead of dominating. That wasn't just spiritual teaching, that was structural disruption. The poor heard eternal hope. The oppressed felt courage to believe. But the privileged heard something else entirely: accountability. And accountability has a way of making comfortable men uncomfortable. His humble strength wasn't aggressive, but it was immovable, and that immovability felt like a threat to fragile egos built on fear. Still, he never altered his tone. No bitterness. No sarcasm. No retaliation. Just unconditional love delivered with clarity sharp enough to separate light in the darkness from shadows hiding in plain sight. Even when questioned publicly, he remained grounded, as if divine purpose anchored his every breath. The crowd began noticing the contrast: calm confidence versus defensive pride. And slowly, admiration for him began turning into quiet resentment among those who feared losing influence. Behind temple walls and polished courtyards, strategies began forming. It wasn't outrage that motivated them, it was preservation. Preservation of status. Preservation of image. Preservation of control. They convinced themselves it was about doctrine, about law, about order. But beneath those justifications lived something older and more human: fear. Fear that living faith spreading among common people might shift the balance forever. And so the shift began, not publicly, not loudly, but strategically. Invitations became interrogations. Conversations became traps. The same voice that healed broken hearts was now being studied for weakness. Yet he walked forward without hesitation, fully aware of the tension thickening in the air. Because when sacred truth confronts fragile power, confrontation is no longer a possibility, it becomes inevitable. The night they came for him wasn't chaotic at first. It was calculated, quiet, almost surgical, as if betrayal prefers the cover of darkness because truth shines too clearly in daylight. Torches flickered against stone walls, casting trembling shadows that seemed to dance like guilty consciences. The air felt heavy, not just with humidity, but with inevitability. One of his own stood close enough to kiss him, yet far enough to have already walked away in his heart. That kiss, meant to signal affection, became the coldest form of identification history would ever remember. And still, even in that moment, there was no panic in his eyes, only sorrow wrapped in unconditional love. They bound his hands as if restraint could limit divine purpose, as if rope could silence eternal hope. The disciples scattered, fear overtaking courage, because living faith sometimes trembles before it stabilizes. Soldiers pushed him forward through narrow streets where whispers spread faster than footsteps. Windows opened slightly, silhouettes watching but not intervening, because crowds often observe injustice before they dare confront it. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't attempt escape. His humble strength was more unsettling than rebellion would have been. And somewhere between accusation and silence, destiny moved quietly forward. Inside the tribunal, polished floors reflected flickering light from oil lamps, illuminating faces trained in authority and hardened in pride. Questions were thrown like stones, not seeking truth but manufacturing guilt. Witnesses contradicted each other, narratives twisted into convenient shapes, and yet he stood there grounded, calm, unshaken. Fearless truth doesn't scramble under pressure, it remains steady. When asked directly if he was who they claimed he was, his response wasn't defensive, it was clear, measured, sovereign. And that clarity, more than any insult, ignited their fury. You could sense the tension in the room like a tightening rope, stretched between fragile egos and immovable conviction. He wasn't loud, but his quiet authority filled the chamber more powerfully than their raised voices ever could. They accused him of blasphemy, of disruption, of dangerous influence, but beneath those charges was a simpler truth. Light in the darkness had exposed their shadows. Pride doesn't forgive exposure easily. And when pride feels threatened, it chooses elimination over introspection. Outside, the crowd that once leaned in with admiration now leaned in with confusion. Some had heard fragments of rumor, others had been stirred by manipulation. It doesn't take much to redirect public opinion, just repetition, fear, and the right voices guiding the narrative. The same people who felt inner transformation weeks earlier now wrestled internally with doubt. Was he really a threat? Was this justice? Or were they watching sacred innocence being processed like a criminal? Uncertainty spread like smoke. When the final declaration was made, it didn't feel triumphant, it felt desperate. Power, when insecure, becomes theatrical. They handed him over not because they proved guilt, but because they feared influence. And as soldiers prepared him for punishment, something paradoxical unfolded. Mercy radiated from the accused, not the accusers. Even bruised, even mocked, he carried grace as if it were untouchable. Sacred sacrifice was no longer a concept whispered in prophecy, it was becoming visible. And as dawn approached, coloring the sky in pale orange and reluctant light, the city awakened unaware that history had tilted overnight. He walked toward suffering not as a victim cornered, but as someone stepping into divine purpose fully aware of the cost. The murmurs grew louder, the tension thicker, the path narrower. And what awaited him beyond that tribunal wasn't merely punishment, it was a symbol that would redefine redemption forever. The walk toward the cross was slow, not because he lacked strength, but because every step carried the weight of sacred sacrifice pressing against human cruelty. The streets that once echoed with curiosity now echoed with divided voices, some crying, some mocking, some silent in uncomfortable awareness. Dust rose beneath battered feet, sticking to sweat and blood in a way that made suffering visible and undeniable. Soldiers pushed, crowds shifted, and yet he moved with a strange steadiness, as if divine purpose anchored him beyond physical exhaustion. There's something unsettling about watching innocence endure violence without hatred. His silence wasn't weakness, it was chosen restraint wrapped in unconditional love. And even under brutality, that love did not fracture. The cross itself was rough, splintered wood, heavy in both material and meaning. When they laid it upon his back, it wasn't just timber, it was accusation, betrayal, fear, pride, and the collective weight of broken hearts carried in physical form. The kingdom of heaven he spoke about didn't look victorious in that moment, it looked fragile, exposed. Yet fragile things don't forgive executioners. He did. That kind of forgiveness doesn't come from emotion, it flows from eternal hope rooted deeper than pain. And as nails met flesh, history held its breath. You could hear the hammer strike, sharp, final, mechanical, and still, something greater than the sound filled the air. Light in the darkness doesn't scream, it persists. His body trembled under agony, yet his words carried mercy toward those who didn't understand what they were doing. That's what makes redemption so disarming. It refuses retaliation. People expect rage. They understand revenge. But grace under torture? That shakes foundations. Even hardened soldiers glanced differently at him, because fearless truth doesn't collapse under suffering. The sky seemed to respond, clouds gathering as if creation itself felt the rupture unfolding. The crowd that once followed him for healing now stood at a distance, wrestling internally with confusion and guilt. Some remembered the stories, the laughter with children, the touch that restored dignity. Others clung to narratives fed by fear. But in that suspended moment between heaven and earth, something invisible shifted permanently. Sacred sacrifice was rewriting what power meant. And power was no longer domination, it was surrender. He spoke again, voice strained yet intentional, entrusting, forgiving, completing. Living faith wasn't dying on that cross, it was being redefined. His humble strength didn't resist pain, it transformed it. When he declared completion, it wasn't resignation, it was fulfillment of divine purpose. The earth trembled, and the curtain in the temple tore, symbol and reality colliding in a way no empire could control. Access was no longer restricted. Mercy was no longer distant. Then came the stillness. The kind of stillness that feels heavier than noise. His body hung there, motionless, and the world assumed the story had ended. Fear dissolved into relief for some, into despair for others. But eternal hope doesn't extinguish at death, it waits. What looked like defeat was the deepest expression of unconditional love humanity had ever witnessed. And love that deep does not remain buried. As evening settled and shadows lengthened, his body was taken down, wrapped, carried carefully by hands still trembling from grief. The stone that sealed the tomb felt final, cold, decisive. Yet beneath that silence, something greater than sorrow was unfolding. Because when redemption enters the grave doesn't remain unchanged. And the story, far from ending, was preparing for a moment that would fracture death itself. The first morning after the crucifixion didn't feel like a new day. It felt like the world had forgotten how to breathe, as if even the sun hesitated to rise over a city stained with confusion and grief. The streets that once vibrated with eternal hope now carried a hollow echo, the kind that lingers after something sacred has been violently removed. Doors stayed closed longer than usual, conversations were whispered instead of spoken, and eyes avoided meeting each other because shared disappointment is harder to carry than personal doubt. The disciples gathered behind locked doors, not out of strategy, but out of fear, their living faith trembling under the weight of what they had witnessed. Broken hearts don't collapse all at once. They fracture slowly, replaying every memory in painful detail. Some blamed themselves for running, others questioned whether they had misunderstood divine purpose entirely. And in that suffocating stillness, silence felt louder than the crowd ever had. The second day stretched endlessly, like time itself had thickened, resisting movement, forcing everyone to sit inside their uncertainty without distraction. They remembered the miracles, the forgiveness, the fearless truth spoken in public squares, and yet those memories now clashed violently with the image of a sealed tomb. It's strange how quickly doubt can creep in when outcomes don't align with expectations, even when unconditional love had been undeniable. Peter paced like a man wrestling his own reflection, haunted by denial, replaying the moment the rooster crowed as if he could rewind it. Mary sat quietly, tears drying into quiet resolve, her grief deeper than words could carry yet somehow not devoid of hope. Some stared at their hands, remembering the bread he had broken, wondering how something so full of life could end in stillness. And every passing hour seemed to whisper the same haunting question: was this truly the end? Outside, religious leaders felt a cautious relief, like men who believed a storm had finally passed after threatening their carefully constructed order. They requested guards for the tomb, sealing it not just with stone but with political assurance, convinced that death had done what argument could not. Yet even in their confidence, there lingered an unspoken unease, because fearless truth has a way of unsettling the conscience long after the voice goes quiet. Roman soldiers stood watch, unaware that they were guarding more than a body. They were standing beside history's turning point. The stone looked immovable, cold and final, the perfect symbol of control restored. But stones have never been permanent barriers to divine purpose. And beneath that heavy seal, silence was not inactivity, it was preparation. The third day dawned slowly, almost tenderly, as if creation itself anticipated something unseen but imminent. The women who walked toward the tomb carried spices and sorrow in equal measure, their steps steady despite broken hearts that had not yet healed. Love often moves even when logic hesitates, and their devotion pushed them forward through lingering fear. They weren't expecting resurrection power, they were expecting closure, the small mercy of honoring a body properly. The sky was still pale when the ground beneath their feet trembled, subtle at first, then undeniable. And in that moment, silence shattered. The stone was no longer where it had been, not rolled slightly, not disturbed gently, but moved entirely, decisively, as if death itself had been interrupted mid-sentence. Light in the darkness doesn't negotiate, it overcomes. The guards who once stood rigid now lay shaken, their authority dissolved in the presence of something greater than military power. Inside the tomb, absence spoke louder than any proclamation ever could, because the grave that was meant to contain had become evidence of release. Cloths lay folded, intentional, not chaotic, not stolen. And confusion collided with awe in a way that made breath catch in trembling lungs. When he appeared, it wasn't theatrical, it was personal. Resurrection power didn't arrive as spectacle, it arrived as presence. He spoke names softly, restoring courage to believe in voices that had almost surrendered. Living faith reignited not as blind optimism but as awakened certainty, stronger because it had survived despair. The same unconditional love that endured the cross now stood victorious over death, not distant, not abstract, but tangible. And in their widened eyes, hope transformed from memory into reality. What had felt like defeat revealed itself as the deepest strategy of redemption ever conceived, because divine purpose had not been interrupted, it had been fulfilled. Death had done its worst and found itself undone. The silence of 3 days was not abandonment, it was anticipation. And as realization began spreading like sunrise across trembling hearts, one truth became unavoidable. The story they thought had ended had only just begun. When the news began to spread, it didn't move like gossip, it moved like wildfire carried by wind that no one could control, because resurrection power doesn't stay contained within stone walls or frightened rooms. The same disciples who had locked themselves away now stepped outside with eyes burning in awakened living faith, their fear replaced by courage to believe that death had truly been defeated. You could see the shift in their posture, in their tone, in the steadiness of their breath. It wasn't denial of what happened, it was understanding of why it happened. Eternal hope was no longer theoretical, it had a face, a voice, a presence standing before them again. They touched his hands, saw the scars, and realized sacred sacrifice had not erased love, it had magnified it. Unconditional love now carried victory, not vulnerability. And once truth becomes embodied like that, it becomes unstoppable. He didn't return with revenge in his eyes, nor with condemnation for those who ran or denied him, but with grace so disarming it restored broken hearts without reopening wounds. That kind of mercy doesn't just forgive, it rebuilds identity. Peter, who once trembled under accusation, now stood steadier because forgiveness had rewritten his shame. Thomas, who doubted aloud what others whispered silently, found his skepticism met not with rejection but with invitation. Light in the darkness doesn't humiliate doubt, it transforms it into testimony. And testimony carries weight far beyond argument. Divine purpose was unfolding in plain sight, not through force, but through restoration. As days passed, he walked with them, spoke with them, broke bread again, and each ordinary moment carried extraordinary significance. He explained what they had misunderstood, connected prophecy to fulfillment, and slowly reshaped their understanding of the kingdom of heaven. It wasn't about overthrowing Rome, it was about inner transformation powerful enough to outlast empires. He showed them that fearless truth survives execution, and that redemption doesn't erase scars, it redefines them. Living faith matured in those conversations, deepened by experience rather than hype. And what once felt like fragile belief now felt anchored in reality. The foundation was no longer miracles alone, it was resurrection certainty. Then came the moment when he stood before them one final time, not departing in defeat, but ascending in authority that felt both gentle and absolute. He spoke of a mission, of carrying unconditional love into every nation, every culture, every broken system still suffocating under fear. The responsibility was immense, but so was the empowerment. Because when resurrection power fuels your steps, intimidation loses its grip. They weren't scholars with influence or generals with armies. They were transformed hearts with living faith. And that has always been more dangerous to darkness than any weapon. The sky received him, but his presence did not diminish. What followed was not silence, but movement. Streets once dominated by doubt now echoed with testimony. Men and women who had hidden now proclaimed with quiet authority that death had been overcome. Some listened with awe, others with skepticism, and some with open hostility, because light in the darkness always divides response. Yet the message continued spreading, through marketplaces, across borders, into homes and hearts that had never stood by Galilee's shore. Eternal hope traveled faster than opposition could suppress it. And redemption began crossing cultural lines. People who had never seen him physically began experiencing spiritual awakening, discovering that God with us was not limited to geography. Families gathered in homes, whispering stories of mercy and courage to believe. Former enemies embraced, forgiven through the same grace that restored the disciples. Unconditional love became not just a teaching, but a movement reshaping relationships, priorities, and identities. The kingdom of heaven was no longer a metaphor, it was a growing reality within ordinary lives. And the ripple effect was only beginning. Because resurrection doesn't end with witnesses, it multiplies through them. What began by the sea as quiet authority now pulsed through communities with fearless truth and humble strength. Sacred sacrifice had become the cornerstone of a new understanding of power, and living faith refused to shrink back into silence. The world had tried to close the story with a tomb, but the story had broken through stone. And even as generations passed, the question remained not whether he lived, but whether hearts would respond to that living presence today. Centuries have passed, empires have risen and collapsed, philosophies have come and gone, and yet the name Jesus of Nazareth still carries a quiet authority that refuses to fade into history. That alone should make anyone pause for a second. Because movements built on hype disappear, and legends built on exaggeration dissolve under scrutiny, but living faith rooted in resurrection power endures. The same unconditional love that walked by the sea now moves silently through hospital rooms, prison cells, kitchens at midnight, and bedrooms where someone whispers a desperate prayer. God with us was never meant to be a slogan, it was meant to be a presence. And presence doesn't expire with time. It enters homes without knocking loudly, but transforms hearts when welcomed. Think about it. How many times has light in the darkness appeared when everything seemed sealed by a metaphorical stone? Maybe it was the strength to forgive when pride wanted revenge. Maybe it was peace in the middle of anxiety that made no logical sense. Maybe it was courage to believe again after disappointment tried to rewrite your story. That's not coincidence. That's the echo of eternal hope still active. Redemption isn't a relic from ancient streets. It's an invitation that feels intensely personal. And inner transformation still begins the same way it did by the sea, quietly. He doesn't force entry into anyone's life, just like he didn't force belief in those early days. He speaks with humble strength, not manipulation. He offers forgiveness without humiliation. He restores broken hearts without demanding perfection first. The kingdom of heaven he described isn't limited to geography. It unfolds inside kitchens where families reconcile, inside friendships rebuilt after betrayal, inside individuals who finally release shame. Divine purpose didn't end at ascension. It continues wherever grace is chosen over bitterness. And that makes this story less about history, and more about response. There are still those who resist fearless truth because it challenges comfort, and that tension hasn't changed across centuries. But there are also those who recognize the sound of unconditional love when they hear it. The question isn't whether resurrection power is real. The question is whether we allow it to reshape us. Living faith doesn't mean the absence of struggle. It means hope stronger than struggle. And hope has a way of reordering priorities, softening anger, healing what logic alone cannot repair. That's not theory, that's testimony repeated across generations. You can see it in homes where forgiveness breaks cycles that lasted decades. You can feel it in communities where mercy replaces division. You can witness it in individuals who once felt invisible discovering they carry divine value. Light in the darkness still exposes what harms and illuminates what heals. And sacred sacrifice continues to redefine strength, not as domination, but as surrender rooted in love. The world still tries to build systems without grace, and those systems still crack under pressure. But redemption keeps rebuilding. If he truly lives, then the story isn't ancient, it's active. If eternal hope still breathes, then despair is never the final chapter. If God with us is more than poetry, then presence is available even now. The same voice that calmed storms still whispers into chaos today. The same mercy that forgave executioners still restores the ashamed. The same resurrection power that moved a stone still moves hearts that feel sealed shut. And that brings the story full circle, from a shoreline in Galilee to the room where someone is listening right now. Because the real question was never whether he rose. It was whether we would rise with him into courage to believe, into forgiveness, into unconditional love that reshapes everything it touches. The story that began by the sea did not end at the tomb. It continues wherever a heart opens. If this story moved you, even just a little, then let me ask you something honestly. Where did you see yourself in it? Were you standing by the shore, curious but cautious? Were you in the crowd, torn between belief and doubt? Or were you behind a locked door, afraid that hope had already died? Because this was never just the story of a young Galilean teacher. It's the story of every broken heart that has ever needed redemption. It's the story of unconditional love that refuses to retreat. It's the story of eternal hope that doesn't stay buried. It's the story of living faith that survives silence, doubt, and even death. So now I want to hear from you. Which moment impacted you the most? Was it the cross, the silence, the resurrection, or the realization that God with us is still present today? And here's something even bigger. What song should we turn into the next powerful story? Drop it in the comments. Let's build something unforgettable together. If you want more stories like this, stories that take lyrics and turn them into something deeper, something cinematic, something that stays with you long after the video ends, then subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because the next story might be exactly the one your heart needs to hear.